program, and this is Gerard Fadot, also co-director. Gerard is going to introduce the session in terms of telling you who the speakers are and what we plan to do. And just in terms of timing, what you should count on is that we'll do our best to be done with the presentation of the two papers, because we start off with two academic papers that have been produced as part of the IGC work in this group. And we plan to be done with that by 11 or so. Then we take a short break, and then we have two discussants who will talk both about the papers and about broader issues on this topic, and questions and answers from the group. So you're welcome to ask short questions during the paper presentation, but really the main, substantive discussion might be left towards the end of the morning, because we get to hear the discussant perspective as well. So Gerard will continue.
Good morning, everybody. So, yes, as you have read in the order of the day, the topic for today's meeting is community-driven development. This is an umbrella that covers a whole lot of things, but the basic idea is that development projects that are under this title are supposed to be bubbling up from the bottom to top. So the idea is that instead of imposing top-to-bottom planning decisions from the central governments, you basically, the idea is to go down to the grassroots and ask what people need and basically fund them directly. There's different wrinkles to this, and I hope that in the different countries this will come up. An additional layer that unifies the two programs we are going to see today is that both of them are set up in the context of post-conflict countries, right? In Sierra Leone and in Liberia. Therefore, this means that an additional objective of these community-driven projects in this particular context, at least it was nominally intended, was the idea of reconstructing the social networks that were supposed to be heavily dislocated by the civil war and the conflict. Right? The authors are going to be much more specific about what they mean in their particular context. I guess the only thing that's left here is to present the two speakers. So in this particular group, in the group that Eliana and I co-directed of the political economy group, we're trying to merge. I guess we are the place in the IGC where we're trying to put closer economists and political scientists, and actually the two speakers today are an example of this. So we have an economist, we have Rachel Glennester that's going to talk first. She's an economist, and she does me also a part-time policymaker. So she really covers all the types that we live at the IGC. She is right now the executive director of JPAL, which should be very well known by people that know what have been the latest development in particularly empirical techniques in development economics. They've been at the forefront of pushing the techniques of randomized control evaluations, and actually a good example of the fruits of this work is the two papers that we're going to see today. And the other speaker is Professor Jim Fearon. He's a political scientist, so that covers for the other half of our constituency. He's a general professor at Stanford University, and he's done a lot of work, very influential work on the theory actually of conflict, and now he's moving more towards doing empirical stuff and work. So there's much more to do.
Thank you, and it's great to be talking with Jim Fearon, because these two projects happen side by side in Sierra Leone and Liberia. We talked quite a bit while they were going on, so it's great to then present in the same venue and see the comparison of results. Sorry, I should go back and say this work is joint with Ted Miguel and Kate Casey, who is in the audience, so any difficult questions, to Kate. So the motivation for this work is, I think, has many aspects. One is the institutional literature, which talks about how important institutions are in determining the path of development. And particularly here, I think the feeling that countries that have a history of very hierarchical, non-democratic systems have performed particularly badly. A number of papers, I quote one here from India, but there's very little evidence on kind of being really specific about what you can do as a country that has a bad history. You know, what do you do now? And how do you, what exactly are the right institutions that you should try and put in place, and how do you get from where you are now to there? So that's and so we're going to look at what is the most important kind of project that donors and governments put in place when they want to try and change institutions on the ground, in particular very hierarchical, local, traditional systems. The other challenge that we have is when we're measuring institutional performance, it's very hard to do, because there's so many different aspects of it, and you get what people call a halo effect. So if you have subjective measures of institutions, then you ask investors around the world about whether this country has good institutions or not, and what you often get is they answer, China has great institutions because they're making lots of money, which defeats the purpose of trying to understand whether bad institutions lead to bad economic outcomes. So it's very important to get an objective measure of institutions. Work by a colleague of mine, Ben Olkin, shows that the perceptions of institutions are often quite biased by outcomes. If you've got good outcomes, you say institutions are good. And he then measures actual corruption, and it's very different from perceived corruption. So a key question then is whether it's possible for foreign aid donors to try and change the reality on the ground. And as I say, community-driven development is one of the things that aid donors do to try and change things on the ground. So community-driven development, I don't know how well people know it, is giving money from the bottom up so that people can decide at village level or quite low levels of institutions how to spend the money. But it's also about trying to change the way decisions are made in these communities with a lot of facilitation, a lot of practice, demonstration by doing, forcing the inclusion of women, forcing the inclusion of minority groups into that decision making, with the expectation or the hope that being inclusive about this money will then spill over into other aspects of community decision making. And if you think about it, this isn't community-driven development, but I think it's very relevant literature. It's the literature on quotas in India, where forcing village leaders, forcing villages to have women leaders in some communities meant that attitudes towards women changed. So sort of an external forcing of a change of an institution actually changed attitudes towards women. And in a sense, that's what CDD is trying to do. It's trying to say, we're making you be inclusive for these projects in the hope that you learn that actually women are good decision makers, and teaching the women that they can participate. So we're going to look at a specific example of a community-driven development project in Sierra Leone, which, as we've heard, is a post-conflict environment. Although I have to say, sort of the area where we're working, it was a bit later after the conflict than in Liberia. And we're going to use a randomized evaluation approach to testing the impact of CDD. But I think one of the key things that two additional things that we introduce. One is we spend a lot of time trying to develop very objective measures of institutions, in particular participation, collective action, and expropriation by the elite in very objective ways. And if you spent time in this kind of community and tried asking questions, you will know there's a big concern about people telling you what they think you want to hear. And we came across this a lot, and did experiments in the field and then talked to people about them. And the way they described their involvement was complete. Was yes, I fully participated when this guy had been in the other end of the village and didn't open his mouth. Throughout the whole process that I've just observed. So it's very important, I think, to have these very objective measures of participation. We also use a pre-analysis plan where we tie our hands about how we're going to do the analysis that comes out of this work. So before we look at the data, we say, these are the regressions we're going to run, these are the variables we're going to look for, and in particular, of the 320 roughly variables that we're going to use, we're going to group them into families, and we decide how to do that beforehand. As you'll see, that's quite an important to determining our results, that we've done that. So, Sierra Leone, good case for institutions improvement, very poor economic performance even prior to the war. A traditional system and sort of a more modern system running in parallel, very classic in certain parts of Africa. So you have the traditional chiefs who cover, who are in charge of courts and land, while at the same time you've got the formal system which runs health and education. So, and the war was a lot, people think, about the clash between rebellion against this traditional system. So, the seeds of the social unrest being young men who felt very disempowered in the traditional system. They didn't have any rights. So when we talk about youth here, really think of youth as kind of the minority. So women and youth are the minority groups. And it's not that they're a minority, obviously, in numbers. It's that they don't have much say. And youth is non-elders. So it's the classic definition in Sierra Leone is under 35, which doesn't sound necessarily like youth to us, but it's because you're not an elder. So you're not participating in the decision-making in the communities. So what does community-driven development aim to do? Well, it provides financial grants to communities. So in this case, GoBeFo is the name of the project. GoBeFo means move forward in Creole. And they provided about $4,500 to these communities in 3 tranches, which if you look at our communities turns out to be about $100 a head. So, reasonably significant amount of money, although this number is on the small side for community-driven development projects, but the communities are also smaller. So sort of this, if you look at the portfolio of CDD that, say, the World Bank does around the world, they tend to have bigger numbers here, but over bigger communities. So that it's slightly different from the traditional in that sense. Quite a lot of the money gets, of the cost of the project is in training and facilitation. So you've got 6 months of intensive interaction with the community. The community has to come up with a village development committee, which has to include women and youth, who agree on a long-term a medium-term development plan. There's a lot of putting in place of infrastructure, so bank accounts for the community. So sort of putting in place these sort of more formal institutions that can then be used to kind of supplement the traditional decision-making processes. And as I say, there's requirements to include women and youth in this whole process, and you often have youth and women's projects going on. So it's an attempt to do learning by doing in these contexts. We've got a randomized experiment. It's quite large, so we've got quite accurate results. So we've got 236 villages and nearly 3,000 households. And we've got quite an extended time frame. Now you may think that's short to change institutions. On the other hand, that's what this kind of project does. I mean, this is sort of a long time frame for how external aid tries to change institutions. So if we think that, and it's also relevant that if you look at kind of the India women example, the panchayats example, they changed institutions and attitudes over this period. So we combine survey data with 3 structured community activities. And I say this is one of our contributions, I believe. So these are where we provide actual opportunities to communities and see how they respond, literally observe how they respond to these opportunities. One is a matching grant opportunity, which we use to measure collective action. So we provide a voucher which they can redeem at a local building supply store if they match it with their own money. I'll go into this in more detail. We have another one that is looking at how community decisions are made and how our public asset is managed. And we thank IGC for helping us make this happen, because this is obviously more expensive. Yeah.
I don't know if we're allowed to ask questions, but I'll take it all. Where did the intervention come from? Is it that there's some prior notion these are sort of optimal interventions in this environment? Was there some pre-testing, maybe 20 times?
You mean of community-driven development? Or?
Well, no, the 3 particular kinds of interventions you're going to... These are the measuring. These are not the interventions. The intervention is the community-driven development. This is what we're going to do at the end to measure whether institutions have changed. So you've done 4 years of practice of including women and, sitting through lots of sessions where you've got to include women and, having a woman treasurer on the village. So then when I give you a choice between 2 assets and you suddenly have to make a decision within the community, which is not part of the GoBeFo project, do you include women? And we could ask that, or we could actually force them to make a decision and observe whether they bothered to ask women now that they're being asked a new question. So I guess my general point still stands. I mean, who decided this was the way to intervene? And do we know, in a sense, anything close to an optimal intervention?
So this is not, just want to make it that in terms of the intervention is CDD, it's not this. This is the measuring. But are these the right objectives for changing institutions?
Is CDD, in a sense, the best way to go? Or is it just the way we've kind of got ourselves down a sort of an alley where we may be doing this relative to something else that may not be the best way to go?
So this is what we're trying to test, is CDD a good way to change institutions?
Compared to what?
So we can't do an alternative. In this context, we can't do an alternative. What we're going to end up concluding is that this is not a very effective way to change institutions. These kinds of institutions. You may say, do we want to increase, a second question is, are these the right objectives of the intervention? Which I think is actually more of what, do we need more collective action? Actually, these communities have a huge quantity of, they do more things collectively than we do. They clean their own roads, they build their own schools, they hire their own teachers. There's a lot of collective action in these communities. So that is a question, and it's something that we ask, is do you actually, and trust, for example, measures of trust in these communities are very high, and the objective of the World Bank going in was to improve trust and to improve collective action. So we get our objectives from the CDD community, the people who are doing this project at the World Bank. This is what they think, building trust, improving collective action, and we have a whole list of hypotheses which we agreed with them at the beginning. These are the hypotheses behind CDD, and that we was agreed at the beginning. You may decide that that's a stupid thing to try and change. I would argue that there is decent evidence that participation is important. If you look, there's quite a lot of literature, which I was talking about at the beginning, which says that countries with a history of lack of participation and competition at the lower levels perform badly economically. So I would argue there is an argument to improve participation. Well, there's an argument for these others. I think the economic evidence, the literature is less strong.
But the last about managing a public asset is about elite capture. And again, I think there is arguments in the literature that elite capture is important. So as I say, we got these hypotheses about what the objective of this was. In 2004, we wrote those down and agreed them amongst every researchers and implementers. And we wrote down a pre-analysis plan about how we're going to study the data to avoid the concern of data mining when you have lots of variables after the end line, but before we looked at the data. So this is where the project takes place in Bombali district in the north and Bonth in the south. There's a political and ethnic split in Sierra Leone, and this north and south, and so these two districts represent the two main different ethnic groups and the two main political parties.
So these are not heterogeneous districts, these are homogeneous, ethnically homogeneous districts, each of them.
So nothing is completely, there's quite a lot of ethnic mixing and there's quite a lot of smaller subgroups, but this is mainly APC and Timni, this is mainly SLPP and Mende.
Can I make a correction there? Bonth, I would say, is mainly SLPP. Bonth could be PMDC.
Oh, PMDC. Okay, so the SLPP split into the PMDC and the SLPP, and so now this is a centre. Sorry? Oh, these are just the two main political parties in Sierra Leone. One of the main parties split. So the point was, yes, this isn't mainly the SLPP, which is one of the main parties, but for this audience, it kind of, the main Mende party split into the PMDC and the SLPP. So, but they're representative of two different kind of parts of the country. So this is our timeline. We did the baseline in 2005. The project happens over this time. There are a series of different, there's planning, and then the projects are handed out, a follow-up survey, and then we do another follow-up survey to see how, we give out these gifts and then see how they're taken up. So what did this project do? It was split kind of evenly between infrastructure building, community centres, primary schools. You can't really build a whole primary school with $5,000, although it's kind of amazing what they managed to do with $5,000. But you can buy, the tin roof and some other things. You can build a small school, basically. And then there were a lot of economic projects, like seed multiplication and goats. And then there's sort of smaller category of training. And these are some of the projects, the latrines and a bridge there. So, our data collection, as we say, this was an important way of getting objective measure of what's happening on the ground using these structured community activities, which we think are quite novel. So, communities receive 6 vouchers that could be redeemed with a co-pay at the local building materials store for a value of $300. And so whether they can match, so it's a 2-to-1 match, whether they can redeem these is a very direct measure of collective action. Now, they could always buy this material and then sell it. So it's clearly in their interest to get their act together, to get this money together, get the match, and then sell it and redistribute it, even if they don't want to make a public good. So it's really a measure of whether community, but they don't have a lot of cash on hand, so it's a measure of whether the community can get together to do this. A communal choice, so the communities, when we were doing the survey, we said we'd like to thank you for all the time you spent answering all these detailed surveys of youth and non-youth and focus group with the chief, and we'd like to thank you for that. We either have some batteries that you can hand out to everyone, or some salt, iodized salt. We talked about the health benefits of iodized salt. Roughly about half of the community has picked batteries and half picked salt, which was exactly our objective. No difference between treatment and control about which way they went. What we're looking at is how they made the decision to do that.
Was it a sample survey or? Was it a sample survey?
Yeah, so within the communities we pick, how many? 12 households within each community. So 118 treatment, 118 control communities, and then household surveys and a community survey. And then these are done at the village level, obviously.
So for the 2 areas?
Yeah, exactly the same for the 2 areas. But there's a larger sample in Bombali, it's a bigger district. So the enumerators observed what they did to make this decision. Now the community was all gathered together. We asked the chief to bring the community together and then presented them with the choice and observed what they did. Did the chief just say, oh, we'll have that, you know, without any attempt to discuss anything, which happened a reasonable number of times. And in the pre-testing, we enforced that, you know, we discovered that you really had to make the chief bring everyone together, because then they would, otherwise they would just say, oh, we'll have that. My community wants that, you know, in 30 seconds, you know, nearly all the time. So forcing them to have a meeting and then showing them the choice at least meant that some communities had a discussion. And then managing the asset, we give the communities a tarpaulin, which is useful for drying rice, or as or roofing material. So, as I say, we did this pre-analysis plan to avoid, I'm going to skip that slide because I don't have much time and just tell you what we did. As they say, in 2005, we set out what the plan was, you know, the hypotheses, and then when we had the data but hadn't looked at it, we set out in the analysis plan what, particularly important, I think, what family, how we were going to group variables into families. So we're using a mean effects analysis to group the outcomes. And basically we group them into all of the hypotheses. So, you know, trust, collective action, measures of these different hypotheses. And we had, you know, sometimes many, many variables forming a family that could test these. And we submitted it to the JPAL registry so that you could, and then when we wrote the paper, we ran it as we said. Now, there are a few cases where we ran extra regressions, but in the paper, we clearly delineate which ones. As I said, we use a mean effects analysis. So this is, you know, the standard equation for measuring the impact. So we're doing most, I think the key things here are, we're doing most of this, the outcomes are at the community level. So then we average everything that we get for individuals. We have an indicator of whether Gobifo is a treatment village, so, you know, randomized treatment. And we have a vector of community level controls. We can put them in or take them out. And ward fixed effects, so a ward is a group of villages, and some measures were done. Some Gobifo also worked at the ward, but within a ward we have both treatment and control. And in some cases we have pre and post. So some of these, like the structured community operations are, you know, we only have post, but some of them we have pre and post, so we can look at trends over time. So what are our hypothesized impacts? Well, one is participation. So requiring women to participate and youth to participate decreases the disutility of participation. There's some kind of learning by doing. Once you've started participating, it helps. Grants, the grant subsidizing construction reduce the marginal cost of goods and the startup of community enterprises. Leading, so i.e., you've given them money to build stuff, you're going to have more stuff. And you've given money to, you know, start community enterprises, there's going to be more economic activity in these communities. The fact that they've got these community plans and bank accounts makes it easier for them to organize. So these are the hypotheses, right? You've helped them set up the structures for doing things as a community in a transparent way, and that's going to make it easier to do collective action in the future. So what are our results? So our first outcome family is just kind of did the project work? Is there more stuff on the ground? And the result is yes, we've got more structures, more formal structures, more village communities, development groups, we've got more bank accounts. We know that the finances were dispersed, there's quite low leakage. We get less than 13% discrepancy between the amount that the village say they received and what GoBeFo said they dispersed, which is actually pretty low when you think of the level of literacy in these communities, which is extremely low. There's a significant increase in the stock and quality of public goods. And I think most interesting, households have more assets and there's more evidence of more economic activity. So I'm going to get onto the zero institutions result, but I think I just want to emphasize that in a country as poor as this, the fact that you're giving aid and seeing more economic activity and more stuff on the ground is no mean feat, actually. So, we should celebrate that GoBeFo achieved these things. Did it achieve the change in institutions? No. We look at this in, participation, no. Collective action, no. Change in the voice of women and young men, no. No difference on capture by elites. And communal farms is one kind of collective institution that everybody is doing that's not to do with GoBeFo. And so it was a good way of testing whether the decision making was different in kind of other aspects of community decision making. And again, no difference there. So these are the more formal results. Oh, this is just treatment and comparison are the same. I'll skip over that. Trust me, the randomization was real. So hypothesis one, GoBeFo creates functional development committees. So this is this first family, right? Did the project happen? Did it really change things on the ground and hardware effects? So yes, there are more development committees, and there's more quantity and quality of local public services, and this is the economic welfare grouping. Yeah.
So I can't read the coefficients from this far back, but have you done a kind of cost-benefit analysis to get these types of changes? How much do they cost? How can you think about? I mean, you're right. There's a positive coefficient, but it still doesn't mean that the impact effect is really small.
Right. So half of the money is going to the training and facilitation. And the real question in terms of cost benefit. So if you look at the money that they got, they built a lot with these things. So they're building schools at much cheaper than what the government is building schools, for example. I mean, they're managing to achieve stuff with the money they're given at an incredibly efficient rate. However, half the money for this project is going in training and facilitation. If you think that is there because you want to change institutions and there's no institutions change, then it's not very cost effective. So if you say, okay, well, let's just throw away that money because that was trying to do something else, so let's just look at the money they got, then I think it's quite a good return. But it's not clear that you can do that because that money is arguably, that facilitation also helped make sure that the money actually got spent. And then so if you include that money, it doesn't look so good. So it depends on how you want to see that.
And is getting the money conditional on forming these committees?
Oh yeah. You could only get the money if you, and you only got the second tranche if you ticked all your boxes about including women and everything and transparency. Yeah, it's part of the program. What of course we would love to have done was have some communities where we gave them money and didn't have them do any of the rest. But nobody was willing to do that. That's like completely unethical, So despite that these people, are pushing CDD because they trust villages and, you ought to do it from the bottom up, they don't trust them enough to do it without a lot of oversight.
And the earlier construction, the state-driven construction, was that just completely centralized? Or was it actually locally determined some of the time?
What previously?
The government expenditure on schools and health centers and
A lot of it is done through a program which is sort of CDD but is quite centralized. So a lot of it is done halfway between this. This is a much more decentralized version of community-driven development. There's a kind of halfway house. So a lot of the schools are done by NACSA, which is, as I say, it's sort of halfway between central provision and there's some local involvement, but it's kind of done with government, approved schools and, designs and stuff, and they're much, much more expensive than the stuff these guys are building. Yeah.
I'm having a hard time to figure out the training facilitation that you're talking about. So can you hear me?
Yeah, but I've got 5 minutes to go, so I don't know whether this is counting against my 5 minutes.
Here.
Why don't we try and finish seeing the results, and then maybe we'll allow 1 or 2 questions at the end.
Okay. So this is the detail of these. So you can see more of the detail. Is there something? Well, let me just look at this in terms of some of the. So this is, a 0.2 standard deviation increase in whether you have a latrine, midwife posts. So these are the kinds of things they're constructing with the money, and they're quite, important numbers. And total goods on sale. This is the economic activity. There's, 0.7 of petty traders, total goods on sale. Sorry, I said standard deviations. This isn't in standard deviations. This is in percentage. So you've got, right?
No, so like for the public goods, those are percentage. So for the latrines, you're 21% points more likely to have.
Yeah.
These are like for the petty traders. That's an increase of almost 1 trader, and the mean is about. Right.
So you have 2. So this is quite relevant, I think, to understanding these communities. You have 2.5 petty traders in these communities, and you've got nearly 1 more petty trader in these communities. So I think those are economically really quite significant. So we get exactly half the same number of people using the vouchers in treatment and comparison, and no difference in the use of the tarpaulin. So, whether you have a meeting to discuss the tarpaulin. This is the gift decision choice. So look at the kinds of things that we're looking at. So how long did you discuss? Total adults in attendance at the meeting, total number of women in attendance at the meeting. And there's a slightly positive but completely insignificant effect on the total number of women turning up. And we can rule out really quite a small number in terms of women speaking up in the decision making about the choice. And that is something that Gobifo was really stressing, the role of women in decision making, and yet there was nothing. Now, I just want to very quickly talk about the risk of cherry picking. And so, as I say, we've got 318 variables in our all. And if after the event we could have gone through and picked all the ones that were positive, all the ones that were negative, and told completely opposite stories, we could have told a story that there was positive institutional change, the heavy emphasis on participation. So this is the negative, right? So we can also tell a negative story. So we could tell a story which is that the heavy emphasis on participation led to meeting fatigue, which translated into poor management of political disaffection and disengagement. And here are my cherry-picked results to show that. And you have negative effects on did you attend a meeting. So people said they had less involvement in making a decision. They were therefore less able to know where the TARP was, and the supervisor was less able to see the TARP when they went into the community. And as a result of all this fatigue and then depression, that the chief ends up using the TARP, they then don't vote in the next election. So that would be On the other hand, we could cherry pick our results to say that experience with GoBeFo encouraged communities to incorporate more democratic procedures. This created space for new leaders to emerge, including the involvement of, women were more likely to be part of women's groups. And I'm not saying that people deliberately do this. I'm not saying that, authors deliberately go out there to try and get a positive result at all. The fact that I'm stringing together a kind of coherent story is because I think there's a danger in this where you have multiple outcomes of looking at the data and, seeing a pattern that kind of looks coherent and obvious when you've got all the data in front of you. But if you haven't tied your hands, you won't realize that, that's just popping out of you because that's what you want to see. And again, this is our positive story with, our marginally significant, but, significant results. And stronger significance are you a member of a women's group. So let me just talk a little. So we did robustness checks. We've got we've got compliance with our treatment assignment. We got balance in our original observables. We can think a bit about spillovers. We don't think that's a problem. These communities are really quite far away from each other. And there's possibly some spillover because GoBeFo worked at the ward level. So maybe maybe they gave the ward level project to our control villages to make up for the fact that they didn't have anything. But we don't see any evidence of that. We checked for it deliberately, don't see any evidence of that. And we also see that there's not a trend going on in looking at the post indicators. Are our measures simply too blunt to detect a change? I think that's an important question. So now we have a lot of different outcomes, and they, despite what I said about you could cherry pick, if you look at them more objectively, they're kind of all pushing in the same way. The household results, you would get the same result as if you looked at just the structured community activities. So our conclusion is that the CDD project was a reasonable mechanism for delivering public goods to communities. It gave women more voice temporarily. They really did participate more in GoBeFo projects. They really did, they were treasurers of a lot of the community, the village development committees. But it didn't lead to any lasting change on the ground, or gender inclusion or change in social norms. We also tasked for attitudes towards gender, and again, the things that got picked up in change in India. So I think there are a number of questions for future research. A particularly important question is, do we get the positive results on the ground in terms of hardware because of the facilitation, or not? That seems, in terms of cost-benefit analysis, that seems to be a really important question, because it's a cost-effective way of getting things done on the ground if you don't have all that expensive facilitation, but maybe you wouldn't have had things on the ground if you hadn't had the facilitation. So if this isn't the problem, what can you do, and if the coordination and is it coordination and participation that are holding back collective action? Is collective action really what's lacking in these communities? One question is, these are communities where the traditional authorities have enormous amounts of power, and maybe doing things around the edges without tackling that fundamentally is not going to change anything. Now, most people in Sierra Leone would say taking on the traditional leaders is just a non-starter. Some of the people involved in this project at the beginning were saying, we're pushing for it to kind of explicitly trying to create different institutions that the development of local government was also, by some, seen as an explicit way of taking on the traditional leader system. But as soon as it, started happening, everyone said we can't get anything done unless we work with the traditional leaders. So there's this, there's this conflict that if you actually want to make anything happen, you have to work through the traditional leaders, which then ends up kind of cementing their power, and that's a big question, of whether you try and reform those institutions or try and get around them and make them wither. And I don't think we have the answer to that question, but I think it's a fundamental question.
Thank you very much.
Maybe we can take 1 or 2 short questions now. Yes?
I'm thinking about the role of these traditional leaders you have. In some cases, there would be like a benevolent climate, so people may not want to take over their position. That's why you don't observe an increase in community participation.
Yeah, so, and that's what I think almost everyone would say when we do surveys about whether you're happy with the paramount chief or you're happy with the, your local village chief. And it's a whole system. You have a paramount chief and then section leaders and then village leaders. They would say, this guy that we asked for, did you participate in this decision making? He said yes, when we knew he had been at the other end of the village. He said, yes, because my leader knows my views. So why do I need to? But he knows what I want. But, so yes, that may be an issue. But remember that a lot of people argue that the 10-year brutal civil war was really a rebellion against these leaders. So, and they were very strongly targeted in the violence. They were the heaviest casualties because, they get incredibly high ratings when you say, would you trust the paramount chief with $5,000, versus would you trust your MP with $5,000? They're always miles ahead. But on the other hand, you have these deep resentments. And it is a very interesting system where you have the health and education and other things going through the formal system, and it's true in many other African countries, and then land and courts, and so they are very, very effective at making collective action happen, and that may be why we're not seeing more, because you do build the bridges. These guys are building their own bridges, building their own schools, paying for their own teachers. The government teachers may not show up, but their teachers are more likely to, and they are often hiring lots of local teachers. So they are delivering an awful lot of public goods through the system, but it comes at a cost, which is if you're a young male and you step out of line, you have no, you don't have a lot of resources or rights.
I'd like to put forward a hypothesis and get your reaction. I'd like to say I thought it was a beautiful piece of research academically, and which is not the same thing, actually meaningful. In my own personal life, people who were unemployed, I gave an equal amount of money to the wife and the husband, in both cases with no strings attached, a little envelope. The woman immediately handed over her money to the man, because that's what she'd been doing all their life. This is actually an American I'm talking about. In the context of Burkina Faso, there was a female Burkina Faso sociologist who arranged a project for milling machines for the women to use. Burkina Faso is pretty, the woman doesn't talk in public, she tends to be very subdued in any kind of public context. I talked with the chief. The overall situation at the level that you were describing would not have changed. So, if you were looking who turned up at meetings or something, probably would have looked just the same before and afterwards. But he said, this was, the first time we've had women actually talking to each other. He wasn't sure that was such a great idea, but he observed it had happened. And he opened a little box, produced what was an enormous amount of money by Burkina Faso standards, and said, if we could have some more of these milling machines, here's some money. So, do you see what I'm trying to say?
Right.
Maybe your project was expecting some transformative change. I was looking rather carefully at your measures, and it didn't happen. But that doesn't mean that at a more subtle level and a more limited level there hadn't been change.
Right, so that's the question of how can we pick up a small enough change. What I would argue is that if you do this in comparison, say, to the work that has been done in India on giving women a voice there, and I'd argue, you go to somewhere in Rajasthan, a village in Rajasthan, it's not at all clear to me that women are any further up the pecking order than they are in Sierra Leone. And there, you're giving women a formal position of power over the allocation of money. And so in that sense, it's different because it's formal government money, but this is sort of, this is really coming through the government. And on the kinds of measures we're looking at, in the kinds of time frame we're looking at, they see very radical change. They see change in the attitudes towards women. They immediately see more women showing up and speaking at meetings. So I don't think we should say you can't change things in this time frame. And if you do think that we can't change things in this time frame, then we should be doing these projects, or we should be doing these projects for 10 years, not 5 years. I mean, this is the kind of frame that the bank currently doesn't.
Okay.
But
So
there
sorry.
was change in the example I gave you in Bocconi University.
So as I said in the beginning, let's try to give room to the other presenter and the discussant to contribute their own knowledge, and then we do plan on having a broad discussion.
All right.
Yes. So.
Okay. So thanks for the invitation to present this here, and thanks to IGC for funding part of this project. I think it's remarkable, it's remarkable and a good thing so this and Rachel and Catherine and Ted's project, and there's one other which, as far as I know, IGC didn't fund of the evaluation of the NSP in Afghanistan, that are the first real randomized evaluations of community-driven development programs, which is a very, very popular programming model in the foreign aid business. And it's great that IGC has been involved in 2 of the 3. Okay, so how do I make this go? So this is joint with my colleague at Stanford, Jeremy Weinstein, and McCartan Humphreys at Columbia. I'll first give you a summary and then go through it rather quickly. There's a lot of material. I'll try to move quickly. So many billions spent each year on CDD and CDR. A common kind of a core goal of CDD and CDR programs is improving local governance by typically or almost always there's a process of electing a local development council, a community development council, to select a project from a kind of within some parameters, but hopefully or often fairly broad parameters about what the money will be used to build or fund. In various degrees, there's also a goal, of course, of improving material welfare, and the program that I'm going to be talking about, an International Rescue Committee program in Liberia, there was not a whole lot of emphasis on that. They were really much more focused on improving governance. The question that we're asking this project is, does it work, or at least did it work in this this particular example in Liberia? Let me I'm feeling I'm a little shaky. I just got off the airplane, I don't know, a couple hours ago from California. It's 2:30 a.m. I just had some coffee, which I don't usually drink. So, okay. So we worked with the International Rescue Committee to randomly assign this CDR project to 42 out of 83 communities in northern Liberia, 2 districts in northern Liberia, back in September 2006. We did a baseline survey prior to that. To evaluate the program, we did 2 main things. We did a follow-up survey asking about material welfare, opinions about governance, all kinds of things like that. In March, April 2008, more or less at the end of the CDR program. Then we went back in the summer
and ran a kind of community-wide, real-life, what we would think of as a real-life public goods game. It's kind of a very small-scale development project which had matching funds raised in a kind of unusual manner for the communities. But that's essentially what it was, to try to assess impact on actual behavior as opposed to survey responses. And I should note that one of our very able field researchers who helped us run those is here today, Jessica Gottlieb, who can keep me honest. All right, so what did we find? We found that it's kind of the opposite of what you just heard about GoBIFO. In our case, we found no CDR effects on material welfare, but we do find in the attitudinal surveys quite consistent evidence of CDR impact on attitudes expressed in the surveys about support for democratic process, inclusion of marginalized groups, ex-combatants, women, levels of participation, or at least reported levels of participation in various kind of community activities. And trust in community leadership. What we find more interesting and what I'll really focus on today is, I mean that's interesting, but maybe more so is that we find treatment effects or CDR effects on the amount of monies that that treatment communities raise in our public goods game, which is our main measure of kind of actual improved collective action capacity. So why the different results from what you just heard about? This is speculating, but the IRC project actually forbid income-generating projects. Almost all of what communities were allowed to do with the money, they could choose to kind of essentially build things like palava huts, community meeting huts, add some rooms to the school, or in some cases build a clinic. In some cases build wells, build latrines, things like that, but not the kind of projects focused on income generating activities. Why do we find effects on collective action capacity? This I'm really not sure. It could be that, as you'll see details on this soon, that our public goods game gave the communities a decision problem that might have been closer to the problems encountered in the CDR program than the structured community activities that Rachel and her collaborators used in their project were to the GoBIFO project. But I'm not really sure that's true, or if that would explain it. We spent a lot of time in the paper this is based on, and it took a lot of time for us to kind of try to figure this out. We had a lot of different data to say, like, well, why do we see the CDR effect on collective action capacity as revealed in the contributions in the public good game? This is more speculative. It's untangling mechanisms. The only thing that's really identified here is the CDR effect on the contributions. We don't, the pathway by which that causal effect happened is, we have to rely on other sorts of inference based on our survey data and other facts we recorded. But based on that, what do we think? We find no evidence that people became kind of more public spirited or put more weight on community welfare, that project selection was closer to what people wanted in treatment communities, that the CDR program improved communities' ability to sanction people or the perception that sanctioning would be greater. We find no evidence that the CDR program made people trust NGOs more and thus more inclined to contribute in our public goods game because they'd expect that, like, I don't know, we'd actually follow through and deliver on the money we promised to match with. We don't find evidence for that. But we do find quite consistent evidence on, and pretty strong evidence on, is that there was more mobilization activity in the week prior to our measurement game, our public goods game, in the treatment communities. More activity informing the community about what was going to happen, how people should play. People knew more meetings were held, and so on. So our hypothesis is that the CDR program essentially increased kind of a cadre of leaders or leadership experience with similar organizational problems. So we come along and give a somewhat similar problem to what they had kind of gone through with the CDR program, And our hypothesis is that this kind of created kind of a, call it leadership capital to some extent, that could be drawn on again in the CDR communities. And if that's right, I mean, we find not much evidence or that there's, you know, kind of, it was kind of apparent that there's no big organizational or fundamental institutional change. It's not as if the CDC committees that were created by the CDR program are, you know, running the show in these treated communities as opposed to the chiefs. No evidence of that. If that's right, then one might think that, well, this is good, you know, there were these collective action effects, but one might worry that the effects will degrade on the notion that leadership capital might be less kind of robust and persistent over time than actually changing institutions. Okay, moving along. So the community-driven development program model. Already heard some about this before, and a lot of you probably already know about it. You set up, the idea is to set up community-level institutions to democratically select and oversee development projects. The IRC program involves, you know, first they explain, you know, what they have, what the project is about to communities, and, you know, ask if they're interested. They form advisory boards to try to get buy-in from local or the community chief and some of the elders. Then they run these elections to community development councils. There was an emphasis put on electing women, although it wasn't a strict program requirement. There were women on all the CDCs in the treatment communities, usually about a third of the you know, 9 to 15 members. Then they try to run a they try to have a quick impact project, and then they area that had been very, very hard hit by the war and saw a lot of conflict between Mandingo people and Loma people, who were the majority group in the area, in different phases of the kind of back and forth of the war. There was a notion that, well, what they need is reconciliation. So there's a lot of emphasis in the program documents on CDR as a means of getting communities working together and helping with reconciliation. Okay, yeah, as I said, implemented in Vojinjima and Zorzor up in the north on the near Guinea, very hard hit by the wars. 83 similarly sized communities are constructed out of clustering of villages. Almost always this is based on a hub village, which is really the primary place. The other villages are often, you know, a couple houses, typically, or households. After we collected the baseline data in spring 2006, we constructed with the IRC you know, a set of 83 communities, did the randomization in the fall, which was publicly done in Vojinjima and Zorzor, you know, run by our IRC collaborators, and with invitation of chiefs and kind of local officials. It was there was a lot of concern by the IRC as to, like, how would this be received? You know, would this be considered, you know, weird or unfair? It turned out it was very well received. People on the whole really liked it, because it really was seen to fit in with a very heavy emphasis there's been in Liberia on transparency. And it was seen as like, oh, this is a very transparent way to do it. So they were quite pleased with that, I think. IRC was. Then the program runs from October 2006 to March 2008. Mainly it's building of, you know, latrines, renovating town halls, or building them, schools, clinics, guest houses, well, some bridge repair, some road repair. But mainly the small-scale construction. So here's where we were. Here's Liberia. We're up here in Vojinjima district in Zorzor. Okay, measurement strategy. So panel survey. We had the baseline survey, and then this endline survey right after the project ended. I'm not going to talk much about that. The basic results are, there's you know, using a mean effects analysis that clusters, you know, like or questions on the same topic, like, you know, participation or sense of personal efficacy, things like that together, which are kind of naturally grouped into questions on the survey to begin with. Fairly consistent, or really quite consistent, evidence of impact in the direction IRC would like on attitudes and sense of efficacy, other things. No sign of any impact from the survey on material welfare. More on that in a minute. Okay, So, and then, but really the thing I'll focus on are these behavioral or real-life public goods games we played in July to September, conducted in the hub towns. Let me talk about what we did. So we got permission for a community meeting to explain what we were going to do. We'd come have this initial meeting where the community was told, or people who came to the community meeting were told that the community could receive up to around $420, and it was given in Liberian dollars, to spend on a development project. And they were told that how much you'd get would depend on two things. First, we would give a form that said, like, name the 3 people who will be the community representatives, who will be the people who at the end of the process will hand the money to. And the form also had lines for a big project and a small project. And the big project would be what you would spend it on if you got what we call big money, and the other one is what you would spend it on if you got small money. And then the question was like, well, and how much money you would get in the end would depend on how much was contributed by a random sample of 24 adults selected a week from now on when we would come back on game day. So they would make, we would give them about $5 each. They would make a private decision about how much to put into an envelope. After we gave those people surveys, after they made their decisions, we'd have a final community meeting where we'd open the envelopes and add our matching contribution on top of that. We come back a week later, play the game, publicly count the contributions, provide our matching contribution on top of that, give the money to the community representatives, and go. Okay, so a little more detail on that, the actual play of the game. So in half of the communities, we introduced 2 other treatments. So this is confusing, and it's or potentially confusing. Keep in mind that the core treatment here, the core thing we're interested in, is the effect of the CDR program. The CDR program was randomly assigned to half, and then we had half control. We also did the following. In half of the communities, and this was cross-cutting to the CDR, we told them that only women would be selected to play the game on game day. Okay, there would be 24 people, they'd all be women, who would be making these decisions, given the money, and make a contribution decision. In the other half, it was going to be 12 men and 12 women. So people knew this was going to be the case going into it. They also knew, they said, you can do whatever you want with the money. There's nothing like the money has to be spent on women or anything like that. It was just who was going to play the game. Okay. So we would select the 24 people to play the game. They'd each get $300 Liberian dollars in 100 notes to contribute to the public good. They'd make a private decision about how much to contribute, put it in a little envelope, put that in a Tupperware box taped up with a slit in it. They also knew the following, this last treatment, interest rate treatment. In every community, 12 individuals knew that their contribution would be multiplied by 2. In other words, we would add this, whatever they contributed, we would add that on top. The other 12 knew that their contribution rate would be multiplied by 5. In other words, if they contribute 100, we would add up to 500. We would top that up to 500. Okay. This is the interest rate treatment. Okay, and that's true in all communities. Then we would conduct a survey with each individual after they played, not asking them specifically what they contributed. We had a very surreptitious way to connect contributions to the survey results, so we could look at individual level correlates of what people contributed. We also had surveys conducted on game day with the chief and the 3 community representatives, asking about what had happened in the week between the first meeting and the game day, because we were particularly interested. Our prior expectation is we would not find a treatment effect on total contributions, and so we thought we might see some differences in how they organized and made decisions about what projects to select and so on. So we asked a lot of questions about what happened between the game was announced and the game was played. Okay, so this is just distribution of treatments. This is the main interest here. 42 places got CDR, 41 were control, but we also have this other thing of, in half of them, 12 men, 12 women playing, and half 24 women playing. And all of them half get the 2 times and half are in the 5 times group in terms of interest rate. Okay, so advantages of behavioral game. You can be conservative about the surveys that, you go in and you tell people democracy is a good thing, you should do things democratically, and then you come back and we ask them, well, what do you think about democracy? Should you do things democratically? They say, oh yes, we should do that. But is that, do they really believe that? Even if they do now believe it, even if they do believe it, would it affect their actual behavior or ability to coordinate? So we wanted to have some, a measure of actual behavior. That's the main point I wanted to make there. So just some pictures. Some of these places were quite remote and took a lot of work to get to. This is an initial community meeting with, we worked with a local NGO called NEPA, National Ex-Combatant Peacebuilding Initiative, a bunch of former child soldiers mainly. This is Zealous, right? Explaining the game to a community. Then this is, a look at the table after the, we wanted it to be transparent, so we're opening the envelope so everyone could see. We'd count it out and then put our contribution on top of it on game day. This is a community that was happy about what they got. As you'll see, by and large, they did really well. Like the average percentage of possible you could get was 80, and a lot of them, got close to the absolute maximum. But this is in some ways, well, I don't know, there was variation, but there were certainly a number of places where people were quite disappointed, which was interesting. Because they'd often be disappointed even when, you could get as much as 25,020 Liberian dollars, and there'd be places where they'd get 24,000 and be really upset. Why was that? Because they were really sure that everyone was going to contribute the whole amount, and that someone didn't was really bad, which was kind of interesting. So, I don't know if anyone should ever do this again, but if anyone did, you might want to try to think of how to do it so that you wouldn't have these bad feelings, even when they contribute really, close to the maximum. So, okay, contribution rates were very high overall in the public goods game. Average payout about 80% of the total possible. In terms of individual contributions, fully 2/3 contributed the maximum, and the rest kind of evenly spread out over the levels below that. Main treatment effects. So what did the CDR program do? Well, for looking at all communities, there's about a 6.3% increase, or the treated communities contributed about 6.3% more towards the total maximum. We go from about 76% to 82 some percent maximum. In terms of average individual contributions, about 17 Liberian dollars more on average. There was a big, the gender treatment, all women's groups contributed substantially more, a slightly bigger effect. The interest rate, higher interest rates are associated with significantly higher contributions. In fact, an amount about the same as what the CDR program was, so which gives you one way to kind of scale the magnitude of the CDR effect. Now, but one of we quickly learned, and we had wanted to look at whether there were interactions of our treatments and would it be different in the mixed group versus the all women's group. In fact, it was. It turns out that there was a big effect of CDR treatment on contributions in the communities where 12 men and 12 women played, and no effect at all in the communities where all women played. So you see this in the mixed communities in terms of percent of payout, very big, very substantial effect there, and actually slightly less, not significantly different in the all women communities. Now, a first order thing you might think is like, oh, well, maybe men and women behave very differently. Maybe men were affected by the CDR program, but women weren't, for example, would be one hypothesis, and they contributed differently. That's not it. Here's the average contributions of women and men by the mixed and the all women groups. What we see is that in the mixed groups, women and men contributed about the same amount. In fact, women contributed slightly less, but not significantly different. It was when they knew they were playing with other women that they contributed a lot more. Women contributed a lot more. So there's something different that's not kind of just men and women play differently. explain what's going on here.
So Jim, should we read this as what this mixed treatment is doing is having women adjust down, which is something we don't like, and then the men's level is just higher in the CDR. So this type of project can only work by focusing on men and trying to push them up. Should we see this as a policy implication by the fact that women have conformed to the lower contribution standards of the men? And
that's a, okay, so I mean, I'll be getting to like our theories about what's going on here, and that's not, that's not our theory. Why don't you hold that and come back after you hear our story, see what you think. Yeah, let me come back on that one. So, mechanisms. So in the paper we have a model to try to help make it clear, like a model of the game, which is easy to do because it's just kind of standard public goods game with a first stage where where elites can mobilize to try to motivate people to contribute or inform them about the project and so on. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this. How much time do I have? Like 10 minutes or something? We can think of kind of two general ways that the CDR might have worked. One would be kind of direct effects on individuals. So like say making people more public spirited or increasing their value for public goods. Increasing the weight individuals put on community welfare versus cash. Or say by introducing more democracy, maybe the treated communities select projects that people like more, leading them to contribute more because they have higher value for them. Other possible direct effects on individuals would be an income effect. So if it made the communities wealthier, say, then maybe cash has less marginal value relative to these public goods for them, and that's we can already discard because there really weren't very much in the way of material welfare effects apparently. Maybe it improved community sense of who's doing what, and so sense that like people would find out if you didn't contribute the full amount. That would be an individual effect, just like a direct cost of not contributing or psychological cost of not contributing. There's some research which suggests that democracy or voting on things just has by itself, like there's kind of a legitimacy effect, increases people's willingness or value for just for participation per se. That could be something affecting individual costs and benefits for contributing in the game. Finally, you could imagine that CDR facilitated or made kind of increased common knowledge in the community, or made it easier for common knowledge to be generated, and that if our game had developed or in practice had aspects of a coordination problem because people would, for psychological reasons, wanted to contribute more when others were contributing, or actually had strongly increasing returns for public goods, which I think is unlikely, but hypothetically possible, then CDR might have worked by improving communities' ability to coordinate. Finally, okay, so those are effects you could have directly on kind of individuals in the community. We can also think of indirect effects via mobilization activities. So they had a week to prepare and to inform people in the community about what was going to happen and talk about strategies for what to do. It could be that CDR increased experience with solving similar kind of collective action problems and lowered the cost for elites to mobilize or their ability to mobilize effectively. Okay, so this is hard, probably a little hard to read back there, and I'm going to go through it quickly also. But here we're looking at survey evidence from surveying the game players and also the community representatives in some cases. But this is for all communities. This is for the mixed groups. This is for the women only. And forget about the conditioning on quarter for now. That's just look at the top line, although they're pretty much the same. So satisfaction with projects. We don't find evidence that the treated communities. This is the CDR treatment effect. The bigger the difference between CDR and the treated communities, the more it's over this way, and this is a 95% confidence interval. Not really a significant difference in terms of satisfaction with projects in the mix versus women. No real difference in how much they trust leaders. If you trusted leaders, you might think that less would be stolen so that you'd realize more of your contribution and actual spending on whatever it was going to be used for. No real difference there. Did people think they were less anonymous? We tried really hard to make it anonymous and make them be confident about that, but they could worry about it nonetheless. Not really any difference there in terms of no significant treatment effect there. People didn't think they were more likely to be discovered in the treated versus the non-treated communities. Social desirability here really is, you could think about as trust in NGOs. Our questions about how they thought about NGOs don't show any real difference in the treated versus the control communities there. We do find some effects of, in terms of deciding how to, what projects to do and choosing community representatives, they use somewhat more democratic procedures on average in the CDR communities versus the non-CDR communities. Not huge, but there is some evidence that in the mixed communities we see more democratic procedures in the CDR communities, whereas in the women-only communities, no real difference. So that's parallels the contribution results we find. Some evidence that this is the accuracy of your predictions about what other people in the community were going to do in terms of contributions. They were, in the CDR treated communities, they're considerably more accurate in predicting what other people will do. In the mixed communities, in treated versus control, no real difference in the women's communities, which is parallel to the contribution result as well. Down here we've got kind of the next step of what's the relationship between these survey results and average contributions in the community. It's not identified, but as experimentally, but out of interest, all of them are, except trust in leaders, kind of go in what you might expect the right direction. That if you think you're less anonymous, you'll contribute more, and it's fairly consistent across groups. But basically, so none of these things really, except with possible exception of democratic procedure and the coordination hypothesis, seem to be what's going on, we think. Finally, these are mobilization variables. So we asked questions about, how many meetings were meetings held to discuss what to do. Were you contacted by anyone about staying home to play the game or how to play the game? We asked the elites, did you go out and contact people, or what did you do? We asked a bunch of objective questions about what did they know about the project and what was going to happen. We asked about the prior leadership experience of the community representatives and whether they had been on a CDC. And what do we find? Quite consistently in the mixed communities, there's a treatment effect. So in the CDR communities, in the places where we had 12 men and 12 women playing, there was substantially more meetings, more contacting, more knowledge of the game. Leaders were more experienced, had more prior experience, and had more often been on CDCs. We don't see this, there's no evidence that CDR differs from the treatment, the non-CDR communities in the places where all women play the game. So this is strikingly similar to our results in terms of contributions. And we see all these things are associated with higher contributions. So more mobilization activity, more contributions in the game. That's very strong, very strong in the data. So conclusions. Little or no evidence that the CDR program in Liberia increased material welfare. Again, why the difference with the GoBIFO results we just heard? Possibly because the IRC didn't allow for any projects involving income generation, whereas about almost 60% of the GoBIFO projects were of that sort. Okay, on collective action, clear evidence that in the mixed communities where we had 12 men and 12 women playing the game, CDR caused greater mobilization efforts, which plausibly explain better performance in the collective action problem. We think this suggests that CDR might have worked through a mechanism of learning by doing, essentially increasing human resources experience with a related problem. Mobilization also occurs in the all-women communities, but it doesn't seem to be affected by CDR treatment. So it's not that there wasn't mobilization going on in the places where all women played the game. There was. It's just there wasn't more of it in the CDR-treated communities than in the control communities. So what's with that? Well, we don't really know, but here's our best guess. The IRC CDR program was deliberately mixed gender, right? They wanted women on the CDCs. They were, it's part of the whole thing of including marginalized groups. Maybe when we came and said 12 men and 12 women are going to play the game, the natural thing for the chief and the other leaders to do was to work through networks and people who had been employed in the CDC experience. Whereas when we came to them and said, 24 women will be selected to play the game, it may have been that more natural for the chiefs to kind of hand off to women leaders, possibly there's very strong secret society structures in these communities, to women's networks that had been less involved or not involved in the CDC, the CDR experience. There's some evidence for this. It's kind of mixed in our data. There's a role called lady chief in these communities. There are more often lady chief community representatives in the all women communities versus the mixed communities. But on the other hand, we also asked about, are you a member of a women's action group? And it's not clear. I'm not really sure what that is, but those were actually more common. Community representatives more often said they were part of the women's action group in the mixed communities than in the all women communities. So that's kind of mixed evidence there. Policy implications. Well, the CDR approach can work to increase community collective action capacity. If the mechanism is leadership capital, as we're speculating, rather than kind of deeper institutional change, it might not be that large or strongly persistent. Further, if CDD and CDR projects, do as they typically do, try to be gender inclusive and get equal participation by men and women and so on. And you're doing that in place that has the culture has a tradition of gender-specific organization for solving collective action problems, which is very much the case in much of West Africa. Then maybe you'll really only help them develop skills for dealing with foreigners when they come and insist on other mixed collective action problems. Would be one thing to think about. Last slide. These are just some personal impressions that I had. The whole thing was a learning experience about the aid business for me. What I was really struck by, one of the things I was really struck by was the extent to which, this is kind of obvious when you think about it, aid programs like CDD, CDR programs are templates, right? They're one-size-fits-all templates that, an organization like IRC, NGOs, they develop their template and they participate in the RFP cycle with big donors, not desperately, but going from, DFID requests to USAID requests to World Bank requests, etc. With, here's our program, let's do it. We're proposing to do it in Liberia or in Congo or whatever. You've got these templates. They're not going to, there's all kinds of economies of scale at the level of the aid industry here that make a lot of sense. But when you actually apply it in a specific place, key assumptions may not be right. In this place, think about post-conflict reconciliation. There was tremendous tension between Mandingo and Loma in this area based on horrible conflict that had occurred during the war. But that was across communities, not within them, for the most part. The communities were largely homogeneous. There were some mixed, specific communities where there were Loma and Mandingo, and there were problems often related to that. But by and large, the action there was above the level of communities, and this is a program that was essentially, at the level of communities. So there was a bad assumption about where reconciliation needed to happen. Another assumption is that, that in places where war and displacement has occurred, or just in poor countries in general, social capital is low. Not so, right? I mean, like our data, there was what I like to say is it looks like Lake Wobegon. Well, that's not going to work in a British audience. So it looks like northern Minnesota, where everyone is involved in all kinds of civil society organizations. People in our surveys were incredibly involved in all kinds of organizations. There appears to be lots of social capital. Okay, so that's it. Thanks.
Any question you cannot hold until the last discussion? No? Great. So let me tell you.
Quick one. Is there any gender difference? What is the education level of men and women on average?
Very low.
No, but the gender difference there.
Yeah, men somewhat more, but both are extremely low.
Okay. Let me just tell you what's coming after the break, because we want you to come back. So our discussants will try and help us make a sense of the different findings, and they will do so with the perspective of someone who's an academic and is advising the president of Liberia on the one hand, and the perspective of someone who's a member of one of the organizations that has pushed CDD the most, the World Bank, and a researcher as well. So we'll try to see if we can get out of this room at 12:30 with more confidence.
Many of these sessions, I think, will just go by and there'll have been a collection of papers, but I think what the organizers have brought together, two extraordinary papers that have really pushed the knowledge of what we know about these programs, and I think, you know, they're going to have an enormous effect on how these programs get carried out in the future. Thanks also for inviting me as a policymaker, but then qualifying that, because when my leave of absence ended in July, I committed to no more than 15% of my time as a policymaker. So if I'm counting these 3 days towards that, then I can do some other things. So this is me as an academic who happens to be involved with the Liberian government. So I've never been to Sierra Leone as well, even though they're very similar. So I will not come with any knowledge about Sierra Leone. So I want to start off with just something random. You saw the picture of the field team crossing these rope ladders and stuff. Well, I got my hands on the project report from the IRC, and they noted that the randomized selection process carried out by a team of Stanford University researchers, this is in Liberia, obviously, for evaluation purposes has proven useful. However, there were unintended and adverse consequences to this. Many of these communities were considerable distances apart from one another, and roads were often impassable. This meant that community members, IRC staff, and contractors had to transport materials by foot, in some cases walking over 3 hours. This also complicated regular program monitoring and community mobilization activities. So this is sort of a humorous but nonetheless real anecdote of why it's really hard to get some of these programs randomized. And the NGOs, we couldn't do them all in the same area. It was very hard. So kudos. And more importantly, these two papers, in particular the innovation by Rachel's team, to commit to hypotheses beforehand and publishing all of the results, not just the ones that end up with statistical significance by them, is an amazing step. It's a dirty secret of empirical researchers that the median paper is not that informative. And you know, these papers really go beyond that. And also for those of you, well, one more thing. This was yet another reason that I'm very glad that I never entered the business of doing randomized controlled trials, because it's just getting better and better, and therefore harder and harder. And for those of you who are starting your dissertations right now and thinking about this, this became state of the art today, but they had to do this like 5 years ago. So in terms of when you're setting your standards for where the randomized control trials that you're working on should be, you've got to think 5 years from now, because those will be the colleagues who will be critiquing you at that point in time. So I hope this will become basic practice. And therefore our reports and papers should stop horrifying people like my wife, who's a medical doctor, who can't believe the amount of data mining in our business. Okay. So now let's talk about CDD. Now, in terms of the desirability of this, there's really a dilemma from the perspective of a central government or the perspective of a donor who's looking at the big picture, or whether first decentralization and then liberal decentralization is optimal. Here's a picture of the Democratic Republic of the Congo from about 5 years after the Great War there. It's divided into 3 sections. The DRC was decentralized, but by no means was that a good outcome. It meant that there were communities that were so decentralized that they could basically raise their own taxes, form their own armies, and so forth. So there's some optimal level of decentralization. On the other hand, by definition, in a post-conflict fragile state, the central government cannot and does not project power and provide services to the outlying areas. And so therefore, the need for projects that are going to reach those areas where the central government, by definition, is unable to do so is important. Now, the liberal notion, we heard from the presenters about all the mixed gender and the women and the voting that was going on. It's also potentially a dilemma. When the conflicts in Sierra Leone and Liberia were so brutal that they involved child soldiers and they involved recruiting techniques that put essentially youngers against their village authorities and structures, the idea that we now need to empower a male youth between the ages of 18 to 35 again becomes a challenging notion. Of course, on the other hand, if indeed the conflict in Sierra Leone was in part driven by a lack of representation, then that becomes important. But this makes the very nature of the conflict, that youth were involved and that they were undertaking horrific things against their elders in some circumstances, that creates a revolutionary aspect to the conflict, which may or may not be desirable to perpetuate that. Those new power structures immediately following. When I was back in graduate school, I read an English academic, Mark Duffield, who just pointed out not only that just how radical this project was to do these sorts of activities. He wrote in the book Global Governance and the New Wars that underdevelopment has become dangerous. This reinterpretation has become associated with a radicalization of development. Indeed, the incorporation of conflict resolution and societal reconstruction, both of which are activities that these projects are trying to do, resolve conflict and reconstruct the way society forms, amounts to a commitment to transform societies as a whole, embodies this radicalization. Now, Duffield believes that such a project is beyond the capabilities or legitimacy of individual northern governments. With respect to the IRC project in Liberia, I think this was, this was a radical thing. In Sierra Leone, my reading of the paper combined with the website was a little bit more ambiguous. It seems like this was part of a decentralization effort that was supported by the government. However, it was implemented by the World Bank, which means that someone else implemented it.
Well, it was implemented by a part of the government.
By a part of the government. So this is a really important distinction. All right. So the presenters already discussed this notion that local institutions were weak to begin with. Some of the controls of these tests, as Rachel and Jim pointed out, we're describing very participatory and well-developed local institutions. 98% of communities held meetings to decide what to do with the vouchers and the TARP. 1 in 9 people at a meeting were able to speak to decide what to do with the gift, 1/3 of whom were women. That might seem low, but if you were to take a typical economics conference, you would probably find a lower ratio of women speaking there. 86% of villages use the TARP for public purposes. In Liberia, over half of respondents, as Jim pointed out at the end, were involved in 3 or more community organizations. A large majority had attended and spoke at a community meeting in the previous 6 months. And the results from the public games were 1/2 times more, altruistic or community focused than in typical lab experiments. So again, as I think both presenters made this case, these aren't necessarily institutions that are weak. To take Duffield's notion that there was a radical nature in these programs, if we look at the language of the programs themselves, they do seem rather ambitious. in the IRC document. They said this program aims to empower local communities to be drivers and owners of their own recovery through community governance structures that stress choice and accountability. Rachel and co-authors wrote that GoBIFO created new structures designed to facilitate local development, and then in the website, to increase social capital in grassroots communities in order to promote more inclusive and effective development. So these are radical in their aims, to change the way that communities make decisions. That's not a small aim. Now, they did this potentially, one could say, on the cheap. In Sierra Leone, $10 per person per year was spent for 3.5 years in capacity building to enable those communities to spend around $16 per person per year in grants. In Liberia, the numbers were a little bit lower, and I'm borrowing from Rachel and co-authors' calculation of Jim's paper, about $8 per person per year for 2 years in grants, which were spent on 1 to 3 projects. And looking at the budget of the IRC program, probably a similar amount, maybe half or so, was spent in capacity building there. So what does it mean to spend, you know, $10 on changing the way a society is organized? I wanted to do a sports analogy, and since we're in London, but I don't know the rules of fox hunting or polo. Let's go up to Scotland. So imagine there's this old curmudgeonly Scottish golfer who's every time he comes, he swings, you know, and he sees where the ball goes. And he's been doing this for like 10 years. And then all of a sudden, in hole 3, a researcher arrives. Or not a researcher, because in this point, it's the World Bank. And they say, I'll give you a crumpet if you keep your head down when you swing. So what's he going to do? Sure, you know, swings. Okay, takes the crumpet, you know. And then in hole 11, the World Bank returns, I'll give you a crumpet if you put your head down when you swing. So again, you know. And by the way, you can see here he's been hitting the L out of it. That's a golf without an L. So then, now in hole 17, the researchers come and they hide behind a bush. When he goes up to tee off, what do you think they're going to see? You know, it's obvious, right? He's just going to do his usual swing. Now, if at holes 3 and 11, the World Bank had not taught him a different way to do what he's already been doing for the last 42 years, but instead had taught him how to make his golf carts fly next to him in the air so he wouldn't have to carry them, he would probably be doing that in hole 17. But he's not going to change his swing because that's a very deeply ingrained habit. Maybe if those crumpets came every single shot for, you know, for 3 years, that would be a different thing. And here I think it's worth comparing, you know, Rachel mentioned that this is the typical intervention for a CDD. But we might have a counterexample, and that's, so I'm told, I've never been there, but Indonesia. Some of you might have worked there. But I understand these programs, types of programs, have been going on for several decades. And so there could be a different norm established when it's just a normal way for the government and the village to interact with one another. All right, so then the question, do we get behavioral change from CDD? We heard the presentations in Sierra Leone. The summary seems to be that money talks. When there is expenditures, we do get institutional shells of these committees and bank accounts and so forth, and we get stuff, and we get income. Stuff being village infrastructure or whatever. I think this is unbelievable. To find, and this is where Tim, who's probably not here anymore, Tim's suggestion that a cost-benefit analysis be applied, I think, is really important. What is the economic rate of return of this investment? It's a standard way of measuring an aid project. If people were richer and there was more stuff there, I think that would be an easy calculation to do. And I think even an ERR of 0% is pretty great as far as aid goes. Liberia, probably the headline would be, you know, talking the talk and sometimes walking the walk. So there was a marginal improvement in behavioral games when there were mixed gender games. Marginal but statistically significant. Plus there were big survey response changes. People said they espoused these values and so forth. but there was little evidence of staff or income change. In Sierra Leone, there was also talking the talk. This is a quote from one of the chairmen of the village development councils. He said, "We like the GoBIFO approach because it gives us confidence, helps us improve on other activities that are appropriate for human development. Everybody in GoBIFO communities is always involved in planning and development. We manage and take ownership of the projects upon completion." So it seems perfect, and I think in both cases, the survey responses were equally glowing, but as the researchers showed us, trying to evaluate that in a more rigorous way is therefore even the more important. Now, the tests that each paper did were, I think, a huge innovation. To go beyond these survey responses and to basically try to show that the proof is in the pudding is huge. And so this is more for the PhD students out there, because you can't go back and change anything. But again, this was kind of following from Tim's question, which is, were these behavioral tests the right ones? And if you could do it again, would you have changed anything? A couple of the tests seem to be pooling equilibria. So you've either got pooling or separating equilibria, and a pooling one can be more stable because people are already doing a certain thing anyhow. And so to try to change that can be harder. As the best case, like the salts versus the batteries, is one where there's a separating. So at least there's some sort of activity likely if you're on some knife edge. Part of the challenge with interpreting the result in Liberia is that 4/5 of the payout went to the community anyhow, much larger than in a typical public goods game. And so when we think about what this means, we have to think about the treatment on the treated. So what the intervention is measuring then is that 80th sort of percentile, not quite, but, and how that person's mind is switched. Maybe that's who the program's targeting. Maybe that's an angry youth or something, in which case it's perfect. So it'd be good to sort of know who it is, who's the marginal person, who's in one case being cooperative and in another case being selfish. In Sierra Leone, the third intervention, almost everyone used the TARP in a public way as well, so what does it mean to deviate from that? Everyone discussed what to do, although we learned from the presentation that they had to be coerced into that. So again, it went from one pooling to another pooling. Another question I had with the tests is what is implied by better institutions? Some of the questions around the second intervention in Sierra Leone, which was this batteries or salt question. What do you want, batteries or salt? What would we do if Paul Collier came in and he said, I've got a box of Swiss chocolate or French wine, and you can each either get a bunch of chocolate or a bottle of wine. What do you want? And how long should we spend talking about that? 30 seconds? We got stuff to do here. So if a community spent 45 minutes debating this question, they need both of them, right? You're going to eat that chocolate and drink that wine eventually. So what does it really matter which one you get first? And then, so it's sort of like, what's the right answer, and what does it mean to be more developed if you have a bunch of youth participating in that discussion? But I recognize that that's the hypotheses that were generated at the time. And then with respect to the first intervention, which is these vouchers that get scaled up by 50%, I think a key difference between the two papers was that the public goods game in Liberia got scaled up by either 100% or 400%. In Sierra Leone, it got scaled up by 50%. And it was in chunks to buy construction material. So in this case, let's say Celine Dion is playing tonight. And the intervention in this case, because everyone wants to see a Celine Dion concert, right? Canadian. Is that, okay, I've got a pack of 3 Celine Dion tickets, and you only have to pay for 2 of them. How is this going to get divvied up? Well, you're going to grab your 2 friends and say, let's go in on it. If you're getting construction material for your house, having that ready cash along and being able to increase it by 50%, this might be an exercise in elite coalitions as opposed to public goods in general. And so, yeah, it'd be interesting to be proven wrong with that hypothesis. All right. So, you know, as a policymaker, I was in Liberia last week, and you know, I've been asked to discuss these papers, and I didn't know anything about community-driven development or the project in Liberia besides having downloaded the earlier draft on the CGD website and finding it very informative. But I'd never really heard about it in the discussions in Monrovia. And so I was there with a colleague, and she went to the IRC office in Liberia to see what they were up to. They had vaguely heard of the program, but now they'd moved on. They're doing this ending violence against women program. And now they do have some community-based projects, but they work with existing local governance structures. They said they like to support those institutions whenever possible. Their monitoring and evaluation, the program director there was, when confronted with the CGD working paper, was like, wow, this is awesome. I wish we could do this. Because right now we're just doing straightforward baseline and indicator monitoring surveys, the usual targets and indicators and baselines that we've seen so many times. So the project didn't seem to have stuck there. The Ministry of Planning and Economic Affairs in Liberia, that's responsible for regional development as well as NGO relations, they hadn't heard of it, because the person responsible for NGOs said there was little information on work done between 2006 and 2008 because the process of NGO reporting was not yet well established. So they didn't know what was going on. And meanwhile, community development funds are being established at a very quick clip because the natural resource concessions in Liberia, whether it's forestry, mining, or oil, all involve funds to a community. These funds have not gotten off to a great start. They've had inconsistent organizing principles, and then there's been issues of whether the money was spent and whether it was spent correctly. So there's a huge need to have the right institutions. There's no memory of this experiment. Now this points to a potential mismatch in the case of Liberia and less so in Sierra Leone. Now, if we need only to build institutions early on and then support local institutions later on, but while we're at the point just when we transition from building to working with, we didn't have any institutions in place to monitor those first institutions, then we won't have learned anything from those initial efforts. And therefore, we'll be working with institutions that have no experience from those institutions that were built by an outside actor. Sierra Leone, the opposite. These are institutions that were going to be developed anyhow. They had central government support. They were part of a larger plan. And they were going to be permanently revived. So in the former case, this limits the potential impact of a CDD project if the institutionalizing of the learning project is cut off. It could limit it either to the temporary material relief or social stability. Both of these are hugely important. As the Sierra Leone program showed, that material relief can be real. Social stability we don't know because there was not violence in either country over this period. So they could have played a marginal role in that, we have no idea. There could also be a permanent effect if those initial investments paid off in terms of higher incomes and better community goods in the long run, or a shift in habits. So it would be neat to see in a few years whether there was still any effect from these initial stimuli. And this just points to the perhaps surprising conclusion, given the radical goals of the CDD, that formal institutions, even though they seem, less fun at trying to change an entire society, because it's more administrative law and so forth and regulations and requirements, but these can play an important role, potentially, this is a hypothesis, not a conclusion, to give communities practice with the process of working with the institutions that they've been granted. So you're not just giving the golfer a crumpet twice and then seeing whether he's changed his swing as a result of that. But by legislating that you can't look up until a second after you swing, then you could potentially, albeit in a less fun and radical way, bring about some institutional change. Thanks.
He's again, he's at the World Bank, but he's a researcher in the World Bank, so he's also again somebody with like in both so.
Okay, so I don't have a PowerPoint, apologize, because I don't like PowerPoints. But what I'm going to do is that I'm going to place these two papers in the context of a book we're working on. We finished the draft of, which is a 300-page review of the entire literature on CDD and participatory development. That examines all the evidence out there. It's literally like sifting through a pile of garbage, picking out the few things that are useful. And even those few things amounted to about 400 papers. And then sorting out what that evidence tells us about the entire sort of project of trying to build local institutions via participatory methods, and placing these two papers in that context. Yeah. Now, just to begin with some numbers, the World Bank over the last, so firstly, let's think about this something broader. It's not community development specifically, but participatory development in general. The idea that we want to use the voice of communities to have a say in things that affect their lives. Just that basic principle. Okay? If you take that basic principle, you have two modalities underneath that. One is community-driven development of the sort that we've heard about. The other one is the demand side of decentralization, this business of accountability mechanisms, report cards, and so on and so forth, which is entire business in its own right. The World Bank over the last 10 years has spent about 50 billion on community development and 30 billion on the demand side of decentralization. So 80 billion total over the last 10 years. And the World Bank is one player. Take DFID, you take the Nordic countries, you take USAID, you could probably triple that. So a lot of money is being spent on these visions of hope. Okay, it's very Barack Obamian in some ways. But let's see what we get and what happens with this. Now, one of the interesting things with this is that both of these modalities of common intellectual history, it sort of makes sense to look at them together. And we actually, I'm happy to talk about that later if there's any interest, but let me not focus on that right now. So let's first get to these papers. And first let me say that both these papers are really fine papers. I mean, I've read the literature quite a bit now, and there's a lot of crap. So it's nice to see something very carefully done, very thoughtfully done, contextually done, using innovative methods and randomization. Now, I don't believe that randomization is the only way to judge whether something is well identified. Maybe I'm a little different from everybody else in IGC. But it's very helpful, clearly, to use randomization methods. Previous work has used regression discontinuity, natural experiments, a lot of propensity score matching stuff. But it's nice to see a randomization here. There's some others that are underway that we'll learn more from. So let's first start with the Catherine Casey et al. Paper. I knew her as something else, but she's not Casey. Quickly summarizing, very useful distinction between hardware and software results. So hardware worked really well, software didn't. The use of a pre-analysis plan is, if you all agree, fantastic idea. The use of structured community activities is very innovative. But there are things to keep in mind. Firstly, this was an unusually well implemented project. Now, I'm familiar with the World Bank's work on this area, and one of the critiques we're going to have in our book is how badly implemented they are. This project, about 50% of the budget devoted to monitoring, evaluation, facilitation, all this sort of implementation stuff, if I'm not mistaken, that's right. That is extremely unusual. So the fact that they get this hardware result is in itself an extraordinary thing in the context of the universe or project of this kind, right? So you're going to see that as a really positive result in Sierra Leone. The fact that the software didn't work as well, that we'll come to in a second. That could be for many reasons. Now, one should be careful about this, because in addition to every other kind of selection bias one can think of, in all these kinds of projects, I know the project manager who actually implemented the Sierra Leone project is a friend of mine, wonderful woman. And she's a very smart, very committed person. Not a typical TTL, what we call a task team leader of these projects. you tend to have a selection where the best project managers are inviting randomized evaluations, right? So what about all the crap that gets done that never even gets looked at, which is most of what goes on there? So we are looking at evaluations. I suspect the IRC evaluation is the same way. We're looking at evaluations of 2 projects that were actually at the top of the heap. That's another thing to keep in mind. There's a real selection bias there, I think, is generally true when you're looking at these things. Now, the second thing is that the use of the pre-analysis plan is great, as we all agree. But, you know, and the authors are careful to sort of present the stuff that they don't emphasize, which is the good and the bad stuff that they could have written, depending on, you know, cherry picking the results. But the point is that, you know, there's a limitation to this. All of these kinds of projects have huge externalities, huge unintended consequences. So one cannot always say right at the beginning what you're going to get from them. So that should be kept in mind and balanced with the idea of a pre-analysis plan, which is useful, but then also worry a little bit about unintended consequences you might see, both positive and negative. In fact, seeing that whole slew of results all together, and with, as I'll say later, a good bunch of qualitative work, one can make better sense of what this project really did. And that would be a limitation, I think, of the pre-analysis plan, or at least sticking to it. Well, you should have it, but not necessarily stick to it. Now, secondly, now this business of communal choice, it's not clear to me that when the bank or somebody else says we want sort of gender equality or something of this kind, and you observe, you know, looking at these guys making decisions that it's not gender equal, that's necessarily a bad thing. The chief is trying to do what is optimal for his community, and what is optimal in his community, of which he has much more knowledge. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that the chief necessarily is doing what is good, but let's assume it's a good chief, right? It's not necessarily what is optimal from the community's perspective, what the World Bank wants to do. There's a huge equity efficiency trade-off, and the chief may decide he doesn't care about that trade-off. And who are we to question that decision? And so one should be careful about what we're getting from that particular result. And finally, I'm just focusing on these papers a little bit. The TARP intervention is silly, I think. You know, I'm not talking about the, I hope I don't sound like Rush Limbaugh talking about the other TARP. But anyway, why is it silly? The other two are brilliant, I thought. So the third one is because we have no sense of either of these papers, actually, of one of the most important points of community-driven development, which is to match preferences with outcomes, right? Which is the idea that the whole point of this is to sort of figure out, and demand-driven development, are people getting, using this demand-driven process, what they actually wanted, rather than what somebody imposed on them from the top. So we don't know at the start what the preferences of the elites were for the start. I mean, there's no elite capture at the top. That's a big result. And there's no, you know, most of it we use for public goods. But what did the elites care about the start? Why would they want a big blue piece of plastic? I mean, you know, I wouldn't. So I really had no sense from the paper of what the preferences were to begin. Yeah. Anyway, so coming to the Fearon et al. Paper, which is a slightly different context. Again, tremendously innovative. The use of experimental games. I think it's one of the best papers that uses experimental games in this context. Not just in this literature, but generally, and I think those are very, very valuable tools. And you know, and the authors interpret their results as learning by doing, which I think actually I agree with that interpretation. I think it's about right. And let me come back to that in a second. Points to note. For both with CPSs, what do you call it? Structured SCAs, the methods used by the Casey et al. Paper and the Fearon et al. Experimental papers. For policymakers, they're using this to measure outcomes. But I believe that such methods, if we think through them carefully, can be hugely useful policy tools. Most policy folks are constantly doing pilots of this kind and that kind. And even if you don't have a randomized trial with these pilots, using a few of these games and these structured community assessments, you always play games. You know, any community-driven, everybody who's run a CDD project has played games with communities to figure things out. Using these methods to play more sophisticated games to get a more sophisticated analysis is, I think, a very, very interesting way of going forward. So not just for looking at outcomes, but actually doing better policy. Okay, now the authors find it surprising that the communities start with a high level of collective action. I don't find that surprising at all. They require a high level of community action to start a war. It's necessary in a civil war for people to organize, and so I'm not surprised by that at all. Now, some issues with both papers, certain limitations and certain broader problems. Can you tell me about 10 minutes left?
You have still exactly 12 minutes left.
12 minutes, okay. So some issues with both papers. So neither paper asks several, I think, important questions. Firstly, is this modality of aid, Tim raises this point, is the modality of aid better than something more top-down. Now this is, in this entire literature, a big lacuna. There are 2 papers that do this, one of which is actually a randomized trial, and we don't know anything about this stuff. Really nothing. We know, there are 2 papers, both in Pakistan with the same project that we know a lot about. And yes, in that case, community development does better. But that could be Pakistan, could be that project, we don't know. Yeah? So that's a big question for future research. Secondly, issues of trajectories of same, point that Eric alluded to as well. When you're trying to reform communities, reform institutions, reform the way that societies function, reform the nature of collective action, solve these sorts of issues, and then you're trying to do it via the World Bank, which was invented to basically do post-war reconstruction, which is build bridges and build roads, there's a sort of a disconnect. Building bridges and building roads is sort of a 3-year program. Yeah? You give the money, you get the thing done, you measure it, it's very easy to see if the bridge is being built, you have some engineers there to see whether it was built well. It's easy enough to do. This is not the way reforming societies is done. Right? It's a far more complex, far more uncertain agenda. It's sort of what the evolutionary biologists call a punctuated equilibrium. We have periods of steadiness and huge change. It can take years. Even if you don't notice anything in 3 or 4 years, maybe there are 2 or 3 people who've been activated there. When I was working in Jamaica some years ago, we went 30 years after this huge community development effort by the Norman Manley administration 30 years ago. We went, about 10 years ago, and there were 3 or 4 old men sitting there in each of these villages, suddenly getting activated. Wow, we can do this again. And doing it wonderfully well. By that time, they were senior leaders in their villages. They had a lot of authority. Then they were young guys. They didn't have much help. They were the rebels. Now they're the elders. They did it very well. So this business is a very slow and uncertain process. It has implications for evaluation. Are we evaluating at the right time? It has implications for doing projects. And we have to change the way we think about this if we want to do it right. Okay? Secondly, issues of measurement. We've already talked about this a little bit, so I'm not going to go into that in much greater detail. Issues of institutional context. Liberia and Sierra Leone, I don't know them very well. I'm an Indianist, not an Africanist, have very, very different issues of context. Now, one of the problems, as I alluded to earlier, is that all of these projects proceed with templates. They are not designed with that particular country in mind, and that is a really huge problem. I mean, it's lazy policy. And we've looked at project appraisal documents, that is these design documents for these projects, 300 of them over the last 3 years, okay, from the World Bank. And they literally cut and paste from, and it's like an undergraduate essay. You could accuse them of plagiarism. And nobody's paid any attention to really trying to understand how do we contextualize these projects well. It's a huge problem, something we have to really think about. Now, in Sierra Leone, I would also sort of make the point that maybe I'll make that separately, the authors, since I'm running out of time. Now, both papers, larger point over the entire agenda. Why don't you do some qualitative work? For God's sakes, you say you don't understand mechanisms, talk to the bloody people. I have been, those my friends here are laughing because they've heard me say this for 15 years, 20 years. For God's sakes, we may be economists, but we can also talk to people. I do not understand why we have this bias against doing so. And trust you me, I know you do it when you go to the field. Do a little more systematically, work with anthropologists, do some bloody ethnography, figure out the mechanisms. Yeah. I just don't get it, and I think it's the silliest damn thing in this entire randomization, and all of us are guilty of this, okay? And if we had some quality to work in these papers, we would learn a damn sight more than we do now, right? So, that's my little rant. We do all these, SCAs and, games, wonderful stuff, but, you write a qualitative, add a qualitative component, send to a journal, the journal asks you to cut it off. It's too much anecdote. That is not anecdote. That is serious examination of process, stuff that you cannot do quantitatively. Please change that attitude, because otherwise we're all going to be in trouble. Now, let me just make some broader points now. Yeah, make some broader points. We make the point in the book, and I think it's important to make it here. We all know what is the challenge of development. What is the challenge of development that these interventions are trying to solve? We all know about market failure. This entire IGC event has been largely about government failure, about which we know a lot. Tim has written a wonderful book on it. We know these things. And we know about their intersection, and we're learning more about their intersection. But generally the solution in the policy world has been market failure, government failure. What do? Let's go to the community. The communities can solve that problem, right? But what about civil society failure? What do we know about this business called civil society failure? Communities are inefficient, they lack coordination, they are beset by inequalities, they're beset by group competition, they're full of information asymmetries. They have all the basic problems that lead to failure of the classic economic sort. They lead to of reducing efficiency. How can we assume that these communities are efficient, more efficient than, say, governments or markets in solving that problem? And then we go around when we say these things, we're going to build social capital. I've never understood what that word means. It's the most amorphous concept ever invented. Whoever did so should be shot dead, because there's been about $80 billion wasted thinking things through this silly concept of social capital. It's a much more complex idea than that. With that social capital thing in mind, you're trying to actually fix civil society failures without knowing what the damn thing is. When you haven't thought through what civil society failure is, how the heck can you fix it? And that to do it the same way in every country in the world using the same template. I don't get that mindset. We have to think through as theorists what this civil society failure means, both in a bonding sense of civil society failure within a community and in a bridging sense of the way communities interact with governments and markets. We try to do some of this in this book, which you're welcome to read, download free from the internet when it's available. All right. Secondly, a lot of these projects are really about two things. I mean, participation generally is an organic process. Take the Arab Spring. That's an organic process. Long time coming. People trying to build their capacity and fighting against it. What we're trying to do here is induce participation. We're trying to induce it. That distinction has to be kept in mind. There's several challenges in inducing. One is the trajectory issue that we've already talked about. Secondly, already alluded to, the quality of facilitation, how is this actually done? Thirdly, the importance of context, which is forgotten about. Fourthly, and really importantly, I think, this business of learning by doing that Jim alluded to. How do we learn by doing in an induced sense, in a policy sense? How do we do this? We do this by having effective self-learning systems within the project, which is typically known as monitoring and evaluation. Now, we're all pushing evaluations, that's a great thing. But what do we do with the results? We just saw, Eric pointed out, in Liberia, they've forgotten about this project already. So they've not learned anything from it. Yeah? So, nicely done, piece of research. When you haven't learned anything from it, when that's not part of how the project thinks, there's no point to doing this stuff. More importantly, we have to monitor very carefully all the various things that these projects do. That monitoring, again, my review of the World Bank, a lot of talk. They all do MIS, Management Information Systems Database. You see that word everywhere. You actually go and see what does that entail. Are people actually using it? No, it's too difficult to collect all these indicators. I don't know what that means. You know, no, we don't have the database. We don't analyze. Can I see the data set? The data set is not available. So in effect, a lot of talk about monitoring that is largely pushed from the top, very little action on the ground. And why is this? Ultimately, it's a system of two things. Firstly, of the incentives within structures like the bank. And by the way, DFID is the same. Everybody else is the same. Nobody has any incentives to monitor correctly or evaluate correctly because nobody wants bad news. And it's hard to do this well. Right? And when you do it that way, you're not going to do these projects well. These are extraordinarily complex interventions. And that's the thing that nobody seems to understand, as I'm sure the authors understand now, having seen these interventions up close. These are extraordinarily complex interventions with extraordinarily complex, all kinds of implications of social networks and how these things work, about which we know very, very little. So when we're going to uncertain territory like this, we have to understand by watching, by learning. And none of these projects do that, very few. Indonesia, see, the KDP is one big example where they actually did this very seriously. That's an exception. The NFP, because the same guy who did KDP sort of figured that one out, has a little bit of that going on. I do not know the Sierra Leone intervention. From what I read about from the paper and what I've seen in project documents, they seem to be taking that relatively seriously. I don't know the IRC intervention, perhaps they do. But generally speaking, you don't see this going on. So, to wrap it all up, what have we got here? We've got a lot of money spent on the promise of hope and the promise of feeling good. And I know, I as an undergrad, was a community activist myself. So I have a lot of sympathy for this. Yeah? And we all sort of, if you're any Indian, you sort of start talking panchayats or, cooperative stuff, we cry, we all grow up with this stuff. So, I mean, I have a great feeling for this. I'd love to do it. I've done some of it myself. And it's amazing. You go to a community, see things happening, and say, wow, they're working for themselves. It's wonderful. as a project, when you're trying to induce this stuff via salaried workers working for large organizations with large institutions with their own silly incentives, and their own need to push money out the door, and they own need to fund this and fund that, and they need to promote and get out of Sierra Leone so they can get a job in Washington, all this stuff going on all the time, the whole game changes. You're not doing demand-driven development, you're doing what Judith Tendler, long time ago, called supply-driven, demand-driven development. Okay? It is community development driven from a top-down structure. Not the same thing as participatory development at all. And that's the modality that we really need to figure out how to do that. Okay? Thanks.
Maybe I wasn't clear enough about before. I agree that one of the promises of CDD is reflecting the preferences, so you build the right things on the ground. And we can't really test that because our control doesn't have, we couldn't have a top-down, and that's sort of the holy grail of research in CDD is comparing the top-down and the bottom-up, and do you get something more in line with preferences. We did survey about preferences, very interesting to try and get sort of differences in elite preferences versus non-elite preferences. Very interestingly, we got virtually no difference in preferences about what they would do with $5,000 between men, women, elite, non-elite. So that's very different than some other contexts. So we don't end up making much of it. The other thing I wanted to make a point in terms of the difference between Sierra Leone and Liberia is it's important, while I talked about the ethnic differences and we had Bombali in the north and Bronx in the south, is that the war was not ethnically based at all in Sierra Leone. So, a lot of people come in assuming civil war in Africa is about ethnicity. This was not about ethnicity. It is true that, and other work has looked at this, that the war did build social capital. We had, when the bridge fell down underneath us while we were doing some of this research, and we had to be rescued from the middle of nowhere. How was that happened? Our driver called his CDF network, so the people he was in the war with, defending his village, and they were the ones who came and rescued us. So those social networks were definitely built in the war. On the qualitative point, this quantitative evaluation was accompanied by a very an in-depth qualitative evaluation, which said that Go-Befo was fantastic. It really changed people's perceptions of gender. It changed how women felt they participated more. The community said that women participated more. All of that. So I know that's not necessarily how you were saying. Let's look at some of the processes. We did try and do qualitative work. Maybe it's we're not qualitative researchers. We're not very good at it. And the structured community activities were based on, and a lot of the questions in our survey, which I didn't talk about, we spent a long time trying to get questions that weren't so manipulable by kind of what people thought that we wanted to hear. And that actually came a lot from work that we did alongside anthropologists. So I'd like to think that our survey actually learned a lot from the qualitative work that had been done in Sierra Leone. And finally, on this point about impacting policy, I think, so my view, and this is sort of wider than just the Sierra Leone experience, and partly comes from having been a policymaker for most of my life, actually, before I became a researcher, was that it doesn't, going to the IRC office in Liberia isn't necessarily the way that you assess it. I mean, and the IRC is doing all sorts of randomized evaluations in Liberia, actually, at the moment. Is that it's not necessarily exactly where the project happens, where the most impact happens. I think what we're trying to do is influence, I don't know whether I speak for Jim too, is influence the general attitude towards CDD. So there are a lot of donors trying to decide how do they go forward with improving institutions. And I am certainly making the message that we're seeing very positive impacts from changing voting. So there are a lot of very, as well as the Panchayat paper, there's some very encouraging projects looking at changing kind of formal institutions, getting people to participate more, and getting more competition at the voting level, and getting less ethnic voting and less caste-based voting, and that actually maybe outsiders, and it is about supply-driven, demand-driven. That's why we say the impact of external aid on changing, because that's exactly what this is about. And I think my conclusion from this is that donors ought to be putting their money into the more formal, voting side of things, changing the national institutions, changing maybe quotas for women at the local level rather than this kind of work. And that's not going to necessarily happen immediately with my project going into Sierra Leone, but affecting that debate of where donors put their money.
Okay, so thanks very much. Those were great comments. I agreed with, tons of things you said. There was almost nothing, I think, that I would take any strong objection to. The only things that I thought I'd say anything about was the points that both of you raised, maybe a little more, Eric, about the lack of, that you would, I'd like to talk to you more about your conversations with people in Liberia and at IRC. And the thing you cited about, this was hard to do because we had to, carry goods, we had to go to these foreign, I've never even seen that, right? So I'd like to know, like...
I'll give you a copy.
Yeah. I don't know, just, parenthetically, yeah. Thanks. So parenthetically on that, if they could have, we said, tell us how you want to delimit the larger set from which we'll, draw the random things. So they could have said, well, we only want to go so far from the road, and we would have, but that didn't make it into the. There was a certain amount of, there was a little bit of initial, so some things that were, I think they did rule out a couple places that were really impossible to get to. But, okay, second digression on that, we have great data on the allocation of aid projects because or good data anyway, because we asked lots of people, including the chiefs, to enumerate all the other projects that occurred. And this is another thing that's just terrible. It was terrible that time, the way the stuff by the road gets like tons of stuff. They don't work in the towns. Like the towns are just like totally neglected in terms of development projects, which is kind of interesting. These quarters that we have like very little evidence of or very little NGO project activity. So there really is a I don't know, equity and allocation thing. I think is a big issue there. Anyway, on the lack of learning and on that comment. We could write another, or I don't know, in principle, we could write some really interesting things about the whole process of working with the IRC on this. The IRC deserves tremendous credit for being willing to do this. It was, it was contentious, not hugely contentious, but these are big, complex organizations, and there were a lot of people who viewed this as a waste of time and effort, and were worried that, well, what if it doesn't show that, we have any effects? And they were worried about that. And the whole thing happened because a high-level person at IRC, a vice president, I think, set up a position for someone who is going to try to make their evaluation process more rigorous, and to establish some collaborations with outside third parties in universities. And this woman, Jody Nelson, did a great job at that and really pushed this, and a couple projects got this thing going. And it was only by having a person in the organization to kind of push all the right people and keep lobbying for it, because it's changing what you do, and it's a complex bureaucracy. So there was a lot of effort, and someone had to be in the organization to do it. But then, near the end of the process, she took a different job. And that basically seemed to end the, or I don't know, like we kind of dropped off the map. And I certainly would have thought they would say like, wow, you guys, like, you know, this is great, a third-party evaluation that's done with gold standard randomized, you know, RCT methods, and you find like, you know, our program actually works. You'd think that they'd be like, you know, this would be on their website, right? They'd be talking about this to their donors, but no, it just like disappeared. And you know, and I think it's because, you know, the IRC is a giant ship moving through the ocean, and it doesn't turn easily. It does what it does. So I don't know. So just, you know, on that thing, ethnography. I agree with you. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that a lot there's, and this is kind of a disability of both political scientists and economists, but even more the economists, right? We've got lots of political scientists who think, yeah, you should do this. Go just ask people why they're doing what they're doing, and I agree with you. How would we actually do that? Well, so we do a certain amount of that, you know, for example, with our local collaborators in the pre-stage, like setting up the survey, asking them, does this work? You know, what's the right way to ask these questions here? What makes sense? So a certain amount of that gets built into the survey process, and you know, we pre-tested the games a year before on a small note, like 4 communities in a different part of Liberia. But and then I think you could also imagine it happening post. So I think it would be very interesting to take our findings to our local collaborators and talk to them and say like, well, what do you make of this? I'm not 100% confident that they would do any better than us. In part, that's from the experience of working with them and asking them, you know, in preparation to play the games and do this, we'd ask them, you know, what do you think people will say about this, or how do you think they'll behave on this? And oftentimes they had no idea, or they would give answers that were, or they would make predictions that were just wrong, or turned out to be wrong. Now, even better would be to have like an anthropologist who's been living in one of these communities and could really tell you what happened in the community at the time and afterwards, right? That would be the best thing. But that's, you know, I don't know, I don't think that exists. I don't think there was anyone doing a kind of classic ethnography of one of our communities. The problem with accurate ethnography is it takes a lot of time and a lot of trust, right? To get them to really tell you what happened or to know what happened, you'd have to have someone who had a lot of trust. That would have to be accumulated over a lot of time. And I think that's a major barrier. So stop it.
Thank you. All right, so let's start with questions from the floor. I see one there. Let's take 3 at a time. Ruini, then you, and you. Okay. Yes. Can you stand up and yes. Okay.
So, Jim, I think this is a question for you or anyone else. Because you've worked on conflict for so many years. And I think it's just thinking about what we've learned when we think about public goods and communities. So for a long time, there was the heterogeneity bandwagon when everyone said it's ethnic heterogeneity determines how much people contribute to public goods. Then there was another strand which said, look, it's very long-run institutions, so let's go very far back into history, and Rachel cited, I believe, and Lakshmi's work on that. And then now we have these experiments which are over very short periods, relatively small sums of money, not in relation to per capita income. It's not that that money doesn't matter, but in relation to what governments. How do we, one is how do we put all this together, but the other question is really when you were designing these experiments, what did you do with that sort of received wisdom that you had? And we were talking, Eliana and I were talking over coffee, and it's true that talking about ethnicity in a situation where there's been a lot of conflict is not an easy matter, and it's, you know, we understand why you might want to stay clear of some of those questions in the explicit experimental design. But did you ever think of taking it back and seeing, look, you know, let's see what we know from the census data, and let's try and map that onto the areas that we're dealing with. And when we put all this together, do we have any further insight on whether the interactions that we might have wanted to put in with ethnicity or something else, whether they would have yielded anything? It seems that suddenly we were going from different tribes to men and women when we started talking about heterogeneous and homogeneous. So just a broader intellectual history question, I suppose, on what you make of the whole literature put together and where it's going.
Augustine for CU and Wider. I have a couple of questions, maybe clarifications and kinds of comments. The first one has to do with what I take from both papers, is that direct intervention in terms of changing the rules of the game in institutions is quite difficult. However, it is quite possible to have an indirect change through what I think James Fearon referred to as leadership capacity. So, in other papers I've read seem to go in the same direction because the amount of time is required. What I would like then from the paper the authors discussing then is whether indeed we ought to focus on the second possible modality of change rather than the first. I'm going to make another point that will be my last point, I hope. One issue that was raised by Tim Gesby earlier was whether indeed there's an alternative, better way of doing things. And in some sense, I felt it was an unfair question, unfair point that is being raised. There's the usual problem of whether you have the global optimum versus the local optimum. Obviously, the global optimum is superior to the local. The question is, how do you get there? You have to gravitate toward the result. I think the basic issue, laying aside the question of cost and benefits analysis, is whether indeed the current intervention is priority superior to the status quo or the counterfactual. And if it is, and is justified with our cost and benefit analysis, then perhaps it is worth doing. My last point, and that is the salt versus bathroom. I didn't quite understand why you had that experiment in terms of the salt versus the bathroom. Was it some type of self-selection issue? Obviously, those who choose salt will be the ones who are relatively poor, worse off, and those who choose the battery, I suspect. And if that is the case, how is that taken into account in the experiment in terms of reducing the potential bias? Thank you.
Sir.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for all the comments you made, and I think I really enjoyed it, and I will take this with me. I'm coming from a society, from Afghanistan, full of problems. I do understand what you say, and this is why I could get it. I could understand. These are the questions I'm asking. For the last 10 years, we are implementing projects. Many projects, billions of dollars. You don't see any report saying that this is wrong, that is wrong, don't go this way, don't go that way. All the reports are nice, brilliant, very good. What do we see there? Is poverty, corruption, and nothing else. This is why when you spoke, I was thinking that you are in Afghanistan and I'm listening to you there. Community development, learning by doing, project implementation, all these things. And he was mentioning the last thing, or the first thing regarding going disintegration. In a country after 30 years of war, we are talking about decentralization. In a country where we have got 34 provinces. In the provinces, all you get are warlords. And there we want to decentralize, give the power to them. And they will carry the power to their own generations, like Gaddafi. For 42 years again, then we have to fight. This is the brilliant idea they are bringing to Afghanistan, as you say. They are imposing. They're not working with the people. They are working for the people. And that is the pinching point. That is the troublesome thing. I can give you an example. I'm head of CSO, Central Statistics Organization. I was coming and going at the beginning when I was hired to the gate, and I was seeing about 1 meter off, 1 square meter off wall, dirty. And I was thinking that today or tomorrow it will be cleaned, and nobody cleaned it. After some months, I asked the person, are you going to clean it, or should I write a proposal to UN? Problem is to such an extent. Unless you change the society that way, unless you review, I'm sorry to say that average and GDP is not going to work anymore. We have to review it. We have to find out where the problem is. We have to agree that something is wrong somewhere in the economic system that we are thinking is marvelous. It's not. We have got poverty, which is parallel with the projects going on. You have got poverty everywhere. So, I'm very happy that you pointed out a number of things. We don't have a lot of time to talk about all these things, but we, $1 billion, it came to in the news, $1 billion is missing in Afghanistan. Nobody knows where it has gone. No one knows. And everybody is speaking about it. The government is saying, we are the government. We are saying 20% of the whole health support came to Afghanistan is through the government. 80% is not. And the finance minister says, you account for 80%, I'll account for 20%. And nobody has got any response. So I just want to stop it here, and this is the problem. Unless we have a review, we cannot change anything. Thank you very much.
So, yeah, Jim, would you like to take Ruini's question, and then maybe Rachel follows it?
Yeah. Could I address that?
Yeah, oh, no, sorry.
Rohini, I'd like to talk to you more about this. I'm not sure I can totally understand what you wanted me to, exactly what you wanted me to address, but it has to do with ethnic heterogeneity and public goods. And, saying something about the literature as it's developed there. I'm not sure I have, the things you refer to are studies on a lot of different scales and of different dependent variables and so on. It wasn't a big, so in this particular project, we've looked at, were the more heterogeneous communities, it's not identified causally, but is there a correlation between heterogeneity and lower contributions to the game? No, it turns out. But there's not there's not a lot of evidence there because most of the communities were homogeneous. There's just not a lot of data there. I don't know how to put it all together. I guess I've never been as keen on the proposition that ethnic heterogeneity is a major determinant of lower public goods provision than some of the economics literature have been. But I have to say, I see more. I continue to see studies of various sorts where that's a result. So I guess I'd have to say that although I remain a little bit suspicious, you keep seeing that in lots of different contexts. So I guess I'd say, yeah, I think there's something there in a lot of settings. The other thing I wanted to speak to came up in both the second questions in different ways, but I spent very little time in Liberia for this project, pathetically little. I spent a lot more time in East Africa earlier, at a different time. In Liberia, when I look around there, the little time I spent there, what's overwhelmingly striking is just how desperately poor people were, and so the idea that, and it didn't seem to me that CDD and CDR projects really made a lot of sense there. The idea that spending money to change local institutions was really the way to economic development and prosperity there. It just seems like actually kind of a crazy idea. If you want, I do think institutions matter, but not so. I don't think the problem is with the local level institutions so much as more national or higher level institutions, and that's where the kind of institutional action is for economic development. And it would be much better to spend money on development projects that are focused on increasing economic productivity, that make people produce more and more valuable stuff for a given amount of hours spent working. And that's really what the key thing is at the local level. Stop with that.
Thanks.
So a couple of things on that. We also looked at the results, split different ways, exposure to war, etc. No difference. We have, Ted and I have another paper which looks at public goods and ethnic heterogeneity in Sierra Leone. We find no difference. And we've enabled to instrument for that, and no difference. And I think the answer is, in some countries it matters, and despite the fact that politics is very ethnically divided in Sierra Leone, the war wasn't ethnic, and there's a lot of cooperation between the ethnicities. I want to just follow slightly up on this point about public goods and collective action that came up in the discussions. It is true that there's a lot of collective action, but it's also true that there's not very many public goods. I mean, these communities are very poor, and we do think that having roads and having schools and having health centres are important for development. And given that the only people who are kind of providing those in a meaningful way are the communities, then making them work better maybe isn't such a crazy thing. Although maybe we're deciding that outside agencies aren't really the way to make them work better. The salts versus batteries. So I obviously failed to explain what we were doing. We don't use as an outcome whether they choose salt or batteries. We wanted to choose things that had no symbol which way you went. What we're trying to do is set up a choice so that we then observe how people make the decision. Our outcomes are not about whether you choose salt or batteries. Our outcome is how you go about making the choice between those two things.
So do the discussants want to add anything?
I do want to say something. I want to say three very quick things. Firstly, to answer Rachel's point, public goods don't have to be real, they can also be symbolic. In the following sense, I've written on this, that communities create a lot of symbolic value.
Here.
Sorry?
The other co-author is here, so...
Yeah, yes, I'm sure you will. Public goods can also be symbolic. You're creating something, the capacity for collective action, you're creating the ability to think, you're creating common knowledge, you're creating the ability to act, to coordinate. That's a public good in its own right, and happy to refer you to your paper on that. The second thing is, these sorts of interventions, I mean, going back to this, putting in the larger literature, there is no evidence that these kinds of modalities are good for improving poverty. There's absolutely no evidence. However, there's a lot of evidence that they're good for schooling, they're good for health, because they work via ministries that have already committed to this whole project of using the community voice to sort of respond to it better. The problem is, what you're doing with this is that you're trying to get communities to act against the very agents whose job it is to implement the policy. Okay? You're trying to break what Migdal a long time called the nexus of accommodation with these projects, often. And that's really crazy and very hard to do. And it's not going to be easy. And that's partly the problem here. So these sorts of projects are not a substitute for an ineffective state. They're a complement to an effective state. I think that's the end result of our review of the evidence, that they should be thought of that way. Okay?
All right, so let me try and wrap up by saying what I have understood or not understood from today's session, and then hopefully set an agenda in terms also of IGC's work for our program on this type of topic. So it seems that there is a significant extent of criticism on the traditional CDD approach for failures that have been discussed. And I think that's fair, acceptable. There's an attempt to sensitize to the importance of national and formal institutions to the extent that local and informal institutions have been so much emphasized and maybe charged with responsibilities that they weren't ready to take. And I do think in this respect that some of the ongoing work also within the program that's more on the accountability side but looks at members of parliament and the kind of formal political structures is going in that direction. I think what I had a little bit harder time understanding was one of Jim's last points that I heard as, okay, if you want to do a local intervention, do an economic intervention. So provide, you know, the traditional modality of aid projects. And I thought that the whole origin of this CDD, the way they were born was saying, look, building a bridge or giving cash transfers is not enough because depending on the institutional framework, this may or may not work. So I'm still convinced that while the CDD as it's been implemented or described might not be ideal, we can't refrain from some form of consideration of local institutional structure. And so the open question seems to me, what is the alternative of CDD if you still want communities to be engaged? And to me, this is an open question. If any of you has the answer, you might give it now. Otherwise, the program will try to move along that direction. No? Okay. So this is the official conclusion. And